I'd like to give an example of an integrative project presentation for you guys to follow. I'm using Screencast-O-Matic to give a narrative over a slideshow that's put on PowerPoint. And at the end, I will be uploading this so that you could see the link from Box. Well, my integrative project presentation should be about 5 minutes long, and that's how long yours should be as well. Aim at 4 to 6. And I'd like you to do some sort of format like this, or you can be creative and try other means. But a PowerPoint and a Screencast-O-Matic should be an easy way to go, I think. Well, my project is dealing with a particular issue, how my concept of calling relates to countering religious hatred. How can I counter religious hatred, and how does my calling lead me to that? And particularly, I'm interested in religious hatred that's expressed towards Muslims in America. So I've identified the problem. The problem is religious hatred expressed towards Muslims, and how does my sense of calling, interact with that? Well, the second step is to look for the context of this concern. Why is this problem a problem? Well, I'm looking at some information, and there have been a number of studies about this religious hatred towards Islam in the West, and particularly in the United States. And you see, the biggest part of it is that Islam is seen often as a monolithic block. It's uniform across cultures in people's minds. That Islam is one big force. In reality, there is a variety of Islams. There are some forms of Islam that are very amenable to living in America, and we've met a couple of American Muslims. There's other forms that are from a totally different culture and different expectations. And we read a little bit about that in Nabil Jabour's book as he was interacting with the character that he was describing in his book. And often in our culture, Islam is the other. It doesn't have values, people believe, that are in common with other cultures, and especially the Judeo-Christian tradition. And it's not affected by the values of other cultures either. A lot of people are afraid that Islam is so totalitarian and so isolated as a religion that it doesn't interact well with other cultures and other value systems. Islam can be seen as inferior to the West. It's seen as barbaric, irrational, primitive, and sexist. These are views about Islam that are prominent within our culture. And it helps to, and these sorts of views help to set the scene for religious hatred. Islam is often seen as violent, threatening, supportive of terrorism, engaged in the clash of civilizations, and it's also seen as a political ideology that's used for political and military advantage. And so, oftentimes, people characterize Islam as this monolithic, violent threat to the West. And their criticisms of the West by Islam, as we saw in Neil Jabour's book, as his character was criticizing things he'd seen in the West, those often are rejected out of hand. Those people don't know what they're talking about. Well, this is a context. This is how it becomes a problem. So I'm going to look at this problem of religious hatred, especially this projected towards Islam, from a creation, fall, redemption, new creation point of view, and see how it interacts with that. Well, first, everyone is made in the image of God. God made each person worthy of respect because they're made in His image. And we're also created to live in dependence on God and in interdependence with each other. We're designed to be in relationship with others. And another thing about being made in God's image is that our religious response is essential to being in God's image. You see in Acts chapter 17, where the Apostle Paul is speaking to the wise men on the Mount of Areopagus in Athens. And he's pointing out how God is not far from any one of us, that in Him we live and move and have our being. He's near. We can reach out to Him and perhaps find Him, he says. That religious response is essential to us being made in God's image. And it takes all kinds of forms, but the religious response itself is a part of being made in God's image. Now the fall is where the religious hatred comes to the fore. Sin breaks our relationship with God and disrupts our relationships with others. I picked a verse from Titus chapter 3 that talks about how under the power of sin we end up hating and being hated. It's just hatred is a part of that sinful condition of life. And as I think about hate and how it manifests itself, I think that the fertile ground for hate to grow is fear. And we often calm our fears either by running away from what we fear or by attacking what we fear. And so what you see, for example, is after September 11, there was a march on the mosque in Bridgeview by angry citizens because they're thinking that Islam is a monolithic culture, that the people here in Bridgeview are somehow connected to the terrorists that were flying airplanes into the World Trade Center. But in reality, they weren't. They don't have the same ideology. However, there was an angry response. People attacked what they feared. And there's a lot of uncertainty that creates more fear. Do we know much about Islam? Are all Muslims jihadists? Is everyone kind of a hidden terrorist? So there's this question about it, and that fear or uncertainty really is a ground for hatred to prosper. Well, if I look at redemption, that theme, creation, fall, redemption, Christ brings new life and he gives hope and peace that comes to us through faith. And that word through faith is a key for me, because faith is not something that can be coerced. It's a work of God's Spirit in your heart. People need to be granted the freedom to respond to God in their own time and in their own way. We can't compel anyone to believe. That's not true belief then. Belief must come from inside of a person, drawn by the Spirit of God. Now this is a very important aspect of redemption, because as a follower of Jesus, I'm going to love my neighbor as myself, and I think this way, that as much as I cherish the freedom of religion that I have, and as much as I know that I need freedom to worship and live in the light of my own conscience, my neighbor has a right to worship too. They have the right and the freedom of conscience too. And as a follower of Jesus, if I'm loving my neighbor as myself, I want to make sure that that right of theirs is also protected. Similarly, in the Catholic social doctrine, the principle of subsidiarity points out that the government's role is not to advance a particular religion, but to protect all religious expressions. In the new creation, everyone's going to worship God in Christ Jesus, and all people will live in harmony and peace. The religious hatred will come to an end, because all will be worshiping God in Christ. So for me, the heart of my response, based on creation, fall, redemption, new creation, is that government ought not to be establishing a religion, but that government ought instead to welcome all forms of religious expression and respect them. And that I too, as a citizen, then have the same responsibility to welcome and respect all religious expressions, because faith is something that can't be coerced. And as we do so, we'll become better human beings. So what I believe my calling is to walk in peace with others. I'm a disciple of Jesus. I want to communicate our understanding of God's ways. I want to share that with others. And I want to be assigned to Christ's kingdom. So I'm all about pointing people to Jesus and his kingdom. And what that means then is that with regard to religious hatred, I want to promote religious liberty. I want to foster friendships with Muslims. And I want to defend the rights of Muslims to speak out and to worship and advocate for public rights, equal rights publicly. These are the things that will flow out of my own sense of calling. Now, I also included a reference that we looked at earlier. So thank you. My slideshow went a little bit long, but I did have the introduction that I showed you. So I'd like you to look at 4 to 6 minutes of a slideshow, and something like this would be a great way to do it. If you have another creative way to communicate how a particular problem can be addressed by your sense of calling, please do so. Thanks.